like, that's amazing.
Right. Even better.
Yeah.
Well, I'll introduce you and we'll get started. Good evening. Welcome to the Church of the Redeemer. It's nice to see new friends and old friends. Many people are familiar with the history of the Duke of Windsor, the former King Edward VIII, who gave up the British throne to marry someone that someone just said all related to, and in Baltimore that's probably the case, the twice divorced American Wallace Simpson. It's an often repeated saga that historian and author Jane Tippett brings new insight to through her astonishing discovery of the first and unedited drafts of Edward's memoir, A King's Story, written with the assistance of Life magazine journalist Charles J.V. Murphy. Ms. Tippett was also able to discover hundreds of pages of interviews that Murphy conducted with the couple in 1954 when he was working on the Duchess's biography. She'll explore with us this evening her book, Once a King, and give new life to a story that we thought we all knew. It's my pleasure to welcome archivist, historian, author Jane Tippett.
Thank you so much, David, for the very thoughtful introduction, and of course, for giving me this first opportunity to be here with you tonight and speak in Baltimore, Wallace Simpson's hometown, which, as the Duke said often, afforded him the right to call himself a Southerner by marriage. When speaking about Once a King, the lost memoir of Edward VIII, I feel bound to acknowledge, though, the elephant in the room. Do we really need another book about Edward VIII or about Wallace? A question I'm sure Baltimore residents might readily agree with. The shelves are scattered with them. Dozens have been published in the last decade alone, and few have anything good to say about the only British king to have ever voluntarily abdicated his throne. While I have been gratified by the interest this book has ignited, I continue to be mystified by the critical reaction, particularly in the United Kingdom, which is primarily centered on two elements, either a like, very rare, or dislike, quite frequent, of its subject, Edward VIII, later the Duke of Windsor. Once a King has not converted me, one eminent British critic began, I still find it impossible to love Edward VIII and hard to forgive him. I remember reading the statement with some confusion. Had I asked him to do either? Hardly. More importantly, would a reviewer have reacted similarly to, say, a biography of Franklin Roosevelt, Charles de Gaulle, or dare I suggest, Joseph Stalin, where such questions of whether they had ended up liking or disliking the subject would be considered absurd? These binary categorizations of historical figures are ones that as historians and indeed as critical readers we should avoid, and yet they beset the Duke of Windsor, who continues to be interpreted along these oversimplified lines. Perceptions of him dominated almost exclusively by two themes: his dereliction of royal duty and his supposed affinity for Nazi Germany. Though no stranger to criticism during his lifetime, it was only after both his and the Duchess's death in 1986, with no heirs to guard their legacy, that these narratives began to truly thrive. Dubbed in recent years by some as the Traitor King, these sensational, albeit unproven allegations have been solidified in popular culture by Edward's grossly distorted portrayal in Peter Morgan's The Crown. The result is almost his complete erasure from the canon of 20th century British royal history, even though he was a senior member of that dynasty for over 40 years, and an integral asset to its survival in the period immediately following the end of the First World War. It was a dissatisfaction with these historiographic trends, alongside a firm conviction that Edward's royal career remained vastly underrated and understudied, that I first drew me to him as a subject. Yet I had no idea when I began that Once a King was the book I would eventually write. In the summer of 2022, I found myself 2 years into researching what was to be, I thought, an in-depth examination of the 12 crucial months that followed Edward's abdication on December 11, 1936, and culminated in his disastrous 14-day trip to Germany in October 1937. I believed that by tackling this defining chapter in his controversial history, providing much-needed, albeit missing, historical context to his actions, I would set in motion a longer-term project to reevaluate his life. From the outset, I considered both Edward's memoir, A King's Story, and Wallace's A Heart Has Its Reason to be key sources. But in the early stages of my research, I had not penetrated beyond the published editions, both of which had been prepared with the assistance of Charles J.V. Murphy, an American journalist and long-standing correspondent for Life magazine. It was not until I came across a source note in biographer Andrew Morton's 2018 book on the Duchess of Windsor that I began to think more seriously about Murphy's role in the couple's lives. Morton boasted of having uncovered, quote, the biographical equivalent of Aladdin's cave in finding the uncatalogued archive of Cleveland Amory, who for 4 months in 1955 briefly replaced Murphy as Wallace's collaborator. The reference opened my eyes to the possibilities of what Murphy's papers might hold, if they even existed. It took only a rudimentary search from Google to discover that they did in fact exist and were publicly accessible at the Howard Gottlieb Research Center at Boston University. Consisting of 17 boxes, the collection included over 300 files related to the couple. When I visited them for the first time in June 2022, I was astounded to find the archive had been gathering dust on the library shelves since its arrival in the mid-1990s. The initial dive into Murphy's papers was unforgettable. I found myself reading through an exhaustive record of his relationship with the Windsors, which included a particularly rich concentration of material relating to the time he spent working with Edward between 1947 and 1951. Unedited first drafts of A King's Story were preserved alongside hundreds of Murphy's own notes, many of which were records of conversations with Edward, Wallace, or the multitude of others he had spoken with to gain insight into their lives. A meticulous record keeper, Murphy often dedicated a single page to one typed quote he felt was important, always recording as a header the topic, date, and location. HRH Paris, 1950. I believe in all truth I brought the monarchy closer to the people, but in the process of doing so, I gradually lost faith myself in the institution, were words Edward spoke from his desk at his Paris home. This material was augmented by Murphy's own diaries and his voluminous correspondence, which documented with painstaking precision his impressions and experiences of and with the Windsors. Palm Beach, March 1950. Today, for the first time, the Duke and Duchess faced up to the issues involved in the abdication. It was a weird experience, began one Murphy diary entry. The role of life in the genesis of Edward's memoir also became apparent, as men such as the magazine's chairman, Daniel Longwell, and its founder, Time Inc. chair boss Henry Luce, emerged as central players in the story of Edward's writing. Like so many others, I had overlooked the importance of the 7 articles that Edward wrote for the magazine, published in December 1947 and May 1950, the writing of which spanned the crucial creative years of his collaboration with Murphy, the published book being very much an afterthought for both of them. The cumulative effect of what Murphy had preserved was astonishing, all the more so as I quickly realized that none of it had been published before. It was immediately clear that I had a brand new book to write, and over the next year, along with return visits to Boston, I made a series of further research trips, expanding the collection of primary material that completed this new story. Once alerted to the full extent of Murphy's relationship with Edward, I quickly found in otherwise well-mined archives material that had also been ignored. Most importantly, buried within a box of uncatalogued papers in the Royal Archives were hundreds of pages of Edward's own handwritten first drafts. This discovery very much became the second eureka moment of the project. Not only did these drafts include further and more intimate recollections not included in Murphy's archive, but they confirmed that it was Edward and not Murphy who had been the sole author of these early and unpublished chapters I had already located. The Duke of Windsor first met Time Inc. journalist Charles Murphy over lunch at the Waldorf Astoria in May 1945. Having resigned his position as Governor General of the Bahamas, Edward found himself in New York City contemplating an uncertain and very unemployed future back in exile in France. By chance, Murphy's recently published 3-part series on Winston Churchill in life caught Edward's eye, and curiosity about how his own story in similar hands might be told for an American audience. Via his New York attorney who knew Murphy socially, Edward arranged to meet the author. The two men had what Murphy later described to Henry Luce as, quote, a long and pleasant talk, as Edward discussed the idea of publishing some part of his story. Yet the afternoon produced no immediate result, and the two men did not meet again until November of 1946. In the 18 months that passed between their first and second meeting, the Duke's approach to writing a memoir altered dramatically. His interest in the summer of 1945 had been one of tentative interest. Having spent the last 6 years as Major General to the British military mission in France, and then as Governor General of the Bahamas, Edward was more anxious to secure another official position from the British government. From October 1945 to March 1946, he did his best to persuade his brother, George VI, of the value of this idea. But faced with the implacable hostility of the court and the government's cautious concern, the king refused. I have no intention of remaining idle, Edward responded to his brother in a letter dated April 10, 1946, after he was informed of this final decision. I must look for a job in whatever sphere and country I can find one suitable to my qualification. Rebuffed by the old world, Edward's mind returned to the meeting with Murphy and the idea of trying to bring together some threads of his life in a publishable format. In contrast to the tepid reception he received at Buckingham Palace, Murphy and his colleagues at Life were exhilarated by the prospect of Edward's potential authorship. Though the formal overtures were made by Henry Luce, it was Daniel Longwell, chairman of the board of directors, who took charge of Edward and through a diplomatic, deft hand, secured both his trust and the commitment to publish in the magazine. From July 1947 until January 1951, Edward and Murphy were in each other's company on an almost daily basis. Work began on the Cartes d'Antibes at the Windsor's home, La Croix. Murphy's researcher, Monica Wyatt, who was present throughout, described the comforting routine that developed for the two men. He, Murphy, dines with the Windsors at least 4 nights a week, plays golf with the Duke every afternoon, and then from 6 to 8:30 each evening, he's with the Duke going over what's been done. Murphy, a noted raconteur who loved nothing more than to hold court amongst a group of cultivated listeners, soon became an indispensable element in Edward's milieu, offering him the kind of constant stimulation and interesting conversation that he was so without. But the art of reminiscing did not come naturally to Edward, as Murphy quickly realized. The Duke first needed to, quote, learn the habits of work and be, quote, taught how to organize his ideas. Moreover, Murphy noted, quote, his English reserve is the hidden villain. It is impossible for him to give way to his emotions, and yet he's an engaging, intelligent, and thoroughly straightforward man. Eventually, with Murphy's help, writing did begin, but not, as he described it, quote, with a Churchillian swoop and huzzah, but with Hanoverian indecision. Most of the writing Edward produced with the ever-present Murphy at his side never made it into Life or A King's Story. But that was deliberate. Encouraged by the men of Time Inc., Edward began what he dubbed, quote, an unexpurgated book, one that would, he asserted to Dan Longwell, quote, omit nothing, however secret and personal, and be, as Edward's advisor, Walter Monckton, later noted, quote, his contribution to eventual historians. Once complete, he would, with Murphy's assistance, select a portion for publication. And though the commercial imperatives of his contract with Time Inc. interrupted the completion of this project, Edward began drafting content he had no intention of publishing, and eventually threw himself into a project which gave him a renewed sense of both purpose and vigor. Though nervous throughout of his family's reaction, Edward, as Murphy observed, needed, quote, some dollar exchange, and I suppose a little attention. He would like to be remembered as something more than the man who wasn't allowed to remain King of England. Though not dated clearly enough for us to be certain they were Edward's opening lines, the reflections Murphy titled as HRH La Croix, Summer 1947, offer a penetrating first insight into Edward's perspective as he began his memoir. This is the simple story of a man who was raised to be king and whose thoughts and aspirations were shaped toward that end. Story of my life, or if you wish, career. He continued, I was a simple youth. I had too many inhibitions. I was shy, diffident, a bad speaker. In that sense, I differed greatly from my father, who had a natural flair for a kingly role. However, I learned, teaching myself, a self-made monarch. Central to that apprenticeship were Edward's experiences in the First World War, which he wrote about in greater detail than any other chapter in his life, except the abdication. Though prevented from serving in the front line, he was stationed in France and saw firsthand the horror of trench warfare. One day was like another. Blood, death, destruction, he wrote. War is a strain, and humans should never be subjected to it. The suffering he witnessed forged in him a lasting belief in the futility of military conflict to resolve political disputes. It also awakened in him a deep sense of unworthiness. I had not been allowed to take my chances as a regimental officer, he wrote in the summer of 1947. Not that I wanted to get killed or wounded or taken prisoner or spend 4 years in the trenches, but being denied what I regarded as the proper place in battle for a young man of 20 made me seem different from the other millions of men being offered up for cannon fodder, be they friends or enemies. Except insofar as birth and inheritance were concerned, he continued, which it must be admitted were unique, how different was I from other people? Through the war, I had certainly discovered my shortcomings. Not only I was not better than other people, the fact was I possessed no outstanding qualifications to set me up above my contemporaries. As his drafts moved into his life during the 1920s, Edward began to outline his vision for a radically redefined role as Prince of Wales, one that he believed responded to the expectations and hopes of a 20th century public. His aim, he wrote, was, quote, to democratize the role of the royal family and to bring the monarchy nearer the people. He believed firmly that, as he put it, quote, people thought and felt different about it all since the war, that they had lost some of the reverence for the throne, and they wanted a closer and less formal touch. Refusing to adhere to his father's preference for a top hat and morning coat, Edward adopted a business suit and bowler hat as a standard uniform for public engagements. How could I, Edward reflected, revert from an army major to an upstage prince? No, I was developing my own technique, and I was determined not to be put off my stride. Implicit also in this outlook was his right, as he called it, to, quote, a life outside the office. I decided from the start, he asserted in a separate draft, that I would act as differently from other people as was required of me when on show, but that off-duty, I would work out my own life along the lines of my tastes and inclinations. It was this that made me seek informality, to observe all ceremonial punctiliously, but to dispense with it whenever I could. In the process of the 6 years he spent touring the world between 1919 and 1925, during which time he traveled over 150,000 miles and visited 45 countries, Edward succeeded in living up to his self-assigned brief, transforming himself into an international celebrity, and as a result, drastically redefining expectations for the princely role which he occupied. What had been mere abstractions, he told Murphy, subjects of long leaders in the Times, official reports, now became invested with reality. Life became something more than driving down lined streets with uplifted hat and ready smile. I had got the impression that I knew people, and they knew me. He also readily admitted his increasing obsession with all things American, where during a November 1919 two-week trip, he had caught what he dubbed, quote, the infectious driving power of American business competition and enterprise. Though publicly successful, these long trips separated him physically and psychologically from traditional British court life. His return to a more settled routine in Great Britain after 1925 did little to narrow the gulf. I gained something wonderful from these tours, he wrote in the spring of 1948. Men lived more freely. They were not afraid to speak to me or tell me what they thought because I was a prince. While they were civil and respectful, they had no favor to seek. To return from that was like returning to a trap, back to the atmosphere of the tight little island, the rounds of Whitehall and Buckingham Palace, world of Ascot and the grouse moors, where old ways were important because they were old. The emotional chasm that developed between Edward and the rest of his family during this period was something he recognized and reflected openly on in these private drafts. I believe they, my parents, admired silently my work for the monarchy, he wrote in an undated essay entitled Family. But he added, the truth is that they and I would have been much closer if they hadn't been king or queen. Home life would have been far pleasanter and more enjoyable had it not been fenced in with court etiquette. For however biographers may have written up the legend of the simplicity of my parents' home life, it was only simple in that decorum prevailed at all times. Though the years had softened the impassioned frustrations of youth, Edward nevertheless acknowledged that relations with his father, George V, were dominated by often unsparing criticism. What boys resent, he asserted, are disparaging remarks or insinuations that arise unfounded. The resentment may develop into a row, and the son will retire into his shell and hide his doings from his family. One of those doings was, of course, his relationship with the American Wallis Simpson, who Edward had met in 1931 at the home of his then mistress, Thelma Furness. It was not until 1934, though, that a more serious bond began to develop. It was, Edward told Murphy, no frivolous business. Age was on my side. I had sowed my wild oats, made lots of mistakes. I knew I was falling in love with another man's wife. But remarkable business about love is that one never knows. Love happens before one knows it. One of the more remarkable finds in the Murphy archive were two pieces of Waldorf Astoria memo paper titled HRH's Description of Duchess, a bullet point list of characteristics written in his own hand that Edward felt best described his wife. Very proud, independent, demanding of the highest standards, inflexible code of behavior, strict, exacting, elusive, chic, must have the very best, very sensitive, easily hurt, great sense of dignity, perfectionist to the extent of wearing herself out. About kingship, which he inherited in 1936, Edward was equally frank. He felt at the outset of his reign, as he told Murphy, the temptation to mold, change, influence the affairs of men, to become, as he described it, a modern king. His 2-decade tenure as Prince of Wales convinced him that the monarchy, which he believed should be run along the lines of a large corporation, needed further modernization. This required, as he wrote in an undated fragment, quote, to bring to the tasks of kingship a fresh and original mind. And having formed an implacable resistance to the idea that the monarch should negate all personal feeling in pursuit of royal duty, Edward refused, as he put it, quote, to convert to the rigid or withdrawn ordered ways that had come to be associated with Sandringham, Balmoral, and Windsor Castle, and instead to live according to his private inclinations. Central in both the published and unpublished versions of Edward's memoir was, of course, the abdication. The journalistic homestake, as Murphy dubbed it, securing the story of 1936 had been key from the start to life's interest in Edward's memoirs. But the situation was tricky. The project faced staunch opposition from Edward's advisors in England, Walter Monckton and his solicitor George Allen, who viewed the prospect of any publication with horror. These complex dynamics surprised Murphy, who as an American approached 1936 without the cultural baggage of his British counterparts. As he wrote Dan Longwell in August 1948, Allen is sure the abdication crisis cannot be touched without 1, rousing the sleeping dogs of Britain, 2, offending the present occupant of the throne, and 3, bringing fresh heaping wrath upon the head of the author's wife. People in Britain, he concluded, have no love for our author. That goes without saying. They want to hear no more from him. He shook their world. They want the skeleton to remain in the closet. Edward's own hesitation at tackling this most sensitive of subjects also began to become apparent to Murphy, who noted in the same letter to Longwell, "Our friend is torn. He wants no more trouble. He is sensitive to criticism. He still loves his family and his country. He feels that his position was wrongly presented. He wants to put his side of the affair down, and at the same time complete in the habit of kings the account of a life otherwise not without significance." Edward was finally induced to address the topic of the abdication in August 1948, but it was not until April 1949 that he began to write the chapters dedicated to the final months of his reign. This frank, if not always factually foolproof account, gives us a new awareness of the struggle he endured to find a solution that might honor his commitment to Wallace and secure his throne. Though their romance had made headlines in the United States, primarily after their cruise on board the Nolan in the summer of 1936, the silent accord in England between monarch and media had kept the story firmly out of the British press. In a remarkable passage, Edward himself reflected on the potentially disastrous effect this silence had had upon later events. "I have come to believe," he wrote in January 1949, "that one of the most unfortunate aspects of the crisis was the long censorship which the British press in this connection imposed upon itself. As a result, when the facts were finally presented to the British people, they came in a lightning burst. In the first shock of revelation, much that was human and honorable was seamed by scandal and twisted by politics. The people were staggered. Whether the eventual outcome would have been different, I cannot say. But this I do believe. Had the facts seeped out during the summer of 1936, the frightful blow-up in the winter, a Hiroshima of constitutional politics, might never have come to pass. Or had a crisis been inevitable, the cleavages might have been resolved without so heavy a legacy of bitterness. But I was myself to blame in no small measure for this misjudgment." When the news of Edward's romance did finally break in the British press, the government response was swift. Edward was told unequivocally by his Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin that neither his cabinet nor the Dominions would support Wallis as queen. Edward balked at what he called the opportunistic advice offered by his friend and then Secretary of State for War, Duff Cooper, who suggested he postpone a public announcement of his marriage until after his coronation, scheduled to take place in May 1937. Edward was adamant, as he told Murphy, he could never have gone through with the ceremony and then spring it, as he put it, quote, on an unsuspecting public, a plan to marry a divorced woman. He was also notably mindful of the hypocrisy of receiving communion as part of the religious ritual, a sacrament that he knew was forbidden by Anglican law to his prospective wife. I would not wish to take that which my wife was denied, he asserted to Murphy. With little room to maneuver, Edward decided that his best and indeed only option was to appeal instead directly to his people via the radio, writing, "Short of abdication, which I was desperately anxious to avoid, and to which I was not yet committed, there remained but one alternative that promised to save my throne, that I should go before the British people. Such an act of self-effacement, it seemed to me, would calm the uproar." The prospect of Edward delivering the type of address he desired, one modeled after Franklin Roosevelt's fireside chats, was always remote, but he formally submitted the proposed speech to Baldwin for approval on December 3rd. As a modern man, Walter Monckton told Murphy in October 1949, he wanted to broadcast and lay his case before the people. It was a radical concept, one in which the private life of the king would be a matter for public debate. The message he prepared was direct and informal, breaking the code of kingly rhetoric in almost every way. Speaking not to his subjects as his father would have, but instead to his friends, he drafted an earnest appeal for the opportunity to have, as he called it, quote, a home and all the companionship and mutual sympathy and understanding which married life can bring. However unrealistic the idea, Edward was clearly looking for a means to responsibly secure both marriage and kingship. But the government's refusal was categoric, and Edward was left with few options. Waiting in the wings were press baron and Canadian Max Beaverbrook and politician Winston Churchill, who Edward had approached for support. Hammer and anvil was how Edward first described the duo to Murphy. Winston the aristocrat, an ardent monarchist, Max suspicious, speculative, irreligious. He credited Churchill for being drawn to his cause by old affection, but he was not unaware of the pair's less altruistic motives. In my personal struggle with Mr. Baldwin, they saw opening up a brilliant opportunity for the play of their combined strategic genius. To save a hard-pressed friend, rescue a popular king, and bring down Mr. Baldwin, here was an adventure that not only appealed to their robust natures, but promised at the same time to yield a handsome political dividend in the shape of Mr. Baldwin's downfall. Must give time for the battalions to mass, Churchill advised Edward as he bade him good night after dinner on December 4th. Though vague about the form those battalions might take, the King's Party, as it came to be known, was the name given to what Edward described to Murphy as a tremendous surge of feeling that sprung up for him and the country at large. It was an idea, Edward explained. It had no organization and no formal leader. It was, he continued, a sentimental thing. They had sworn allegiance to the king, and now, when hard-pressed, they were determined to live up to it. Churchill and Beaverbrook became leading members of this phantom-like movement, though neither were ultimately persuasive in convincing Edward to harness its support into an effective opposition. Beaverbrook in particular remained convinced, as he told Murphy in July 1949, that, quote, had the king been courageous and resolute and willing to take risks, his marriage could have been carried off. With boldness and courage, Beaverbrook continued, everything favored the king. The campaign collapsed because the king's men soon discovered that the king would not let them go into battle. Or, as he summarized in a later discussion, we were indeed the king's party. But unfortunately, the king was not a member. Edward's refusal to rally his supporters was not, as is often assumed, another demonstration of a desire to evade high office, but instead the only possible decision he felt he could make as a truly constitutional monarch. To have acted against the advice of the prime minister would have plunged the country into chaos as the king and government clashed openly. That, Edward knew, would have precipitated a true breakdown in the political landscape. No doubt, Edward wrote, there are circumstances upon which a constitutional monarch in modern society might go down among his people as the protagonist of a broad controversial issue. But I could not bring myself to believe that a matter affecting only my personal happiness was properly won. Walter Monckton informed Murphy that it was in the early hours of Sunday, December 6th, that Edward finally came to his decision. His final 5 days in Britain were spent negotiating the terms of his departure and preparing the text of a farewell radio message to be delivered on his final evening in Britain, December 11th. Earlier that day, over a last lunch with Churchill, Edward ceased to be king. That night, from Windsor Castle, he spoke one of the 20th century's most iconic radio broadcasts, providing a dramatic end to the crisis that had swept Britain and the world over the previous 10 days, and immortalizing his future wife forever as the woman I love. Though central to the drama that unfolded, Wallis was both literally and metaphorically absent from it. On December 3rd, the day the news of her relationship with Edward broke in the British press, she left England under the cover of darkness to seek refuge with her friends, Herman and Catherine Rogers, at their home in Cannes. She later confided in Murphy whilst working on her own autobiography in 1954, "That was a terrible day. I was close to the breaking point." Despite at one point threatening to halt divorce proceedings from her still husband, Ernest Simpson, Wallis's pleas for Edward to remain on his throne were unheard, and the abdication became, I believe, the profound shock of her life. Only afterwards, Edward told Murphy, did I realize what a difficult position she was in. Nobody ever explained to her constitutional questions. Beaverbrook makes the point that he could never reach Mrs. Simpson, and because I was king, my orders were obeyed. Nobody went near her. Queen Mother, cabinet, family. I saw to that, knew my own people. They would have made her see the impossibility of her position. It would have ceased to be a matter between a man and a woman. Wallis echoed this sentiment again in conversation with Murphy. Could I have persuaded him not to abdicate? The question has haunted me ever since. I believe now that if someone in Britain who knew what was involved had taken me into his confidence, I might have prevented this tragic thing. But by the time I realized what was going on, it was too late. The king was just as glad that I had made up my mind myself to leave the fort. He said, I must fight this thing out alone. He didn't want me to be directly involved. He kept his family out of it. He said to me afterwards, I was alone on the bridge. I even sent my navigators below. In writing his memoirs, both its public and private versions, Edward had hoped to be the architect of his own legacy. Many in England think I should not write this book, he told Murphy in the fall of 1950. They believe, he declared, I should remain dead but unburied. Yet, he concluded poignantly, I do not wish to be remembered only as a man who abdicated. But his hopes remain unfulfilled. Not only does Edward's legacy continue to be defined by the abdication, but popular opinion has decided that he was most likely a Nazi sympathizer, an accusation that is always effectively illustrated with the infamous image of the Windsors on the steps of Hitler's home. Yet few contemporary versions of this narrative acknowledge the full extent of the 14 days that Edward and Wallis spent touring Germany in October 1937, which had nothing to do with politics and everything to do with Edward's desire to carve out a meaningful future role on the world stage. Convinced that he could carry on the work he had undertaken as Prince of Wales and briefly as King to shine a light on industrial conditions and the crisis in social housing, he accepted the sponsorship of a group of men that included the Franco-American efficiency magnate Charles Beddoes, Axel Wennergren, the Swedish founder of Electrolux, and Thomas Watson, the head of IBM, all of whom backed his aspirations. Germany was to be his debut and establish his profile for a far more ambitious 2-month-long visit to the United States, the highlight of which was to be tea at the White House and a tour of Eleanor Roosevelt's model housing settlement in Greenbelt, Maryland. Unlike their meetings with the Roosevelts, which were planned from the outset, the Windsors' encounter with Hitler was arranged with less than 24 hours' notice, and according to Hitler's translator, Paul Schmidt, the only other person present when the two men spoke privately, was entirely devoid of political conversation. In the context of the period, Edward's decision to go to Germany was not unique. Former British Prime Minister and their World War I leader, Lloyd George, had made the pilgrimage to meet with Hitler in September 1936. And Thomas Watson had only days before he met Edward for the first time in August 1937 taken tea with Hitler in Berlin and been awarded the prestigious Order of the Merit of the German Eagle in recognition for IBM's services to the Third Reich. Watson had become a proud exponent of the slogan, "World Peace through World Trade," and his philosophy chimed perfectly with Edward's, who was encouraged by his newfound sponsors to see himself as part of a group of powerful, dynamic, and self-made men who would engineer lasting international peace and prevent a repetition of the horror they had experienced as young men. To many, however, the most convincing evidence of the ex-king's treachery stems from the 4 weeks that Edward and Wallace spent in Lisbon in July 1940 before they departed for his governorship in the Bahamas. But what is that evidence really, apart from what it says in the Crown? In a series of cables sent to Joachim von Ribbentrop, recovered from the German Foreign Ministry by the Allies in 1945, Edward, in conversation with German alleged agents, expressed his disagreement about the war as being run by Churchill, and supposedly endorsed the idea that he might, at some future date, play a role in negotiating peace between Germany and Britain. Popular myth claims these documents prove Edward's treachery, yet in fact they relay nothing more than political opinions, which, however misjudged and defeatist, were not unique to him. Moreover, few acknowledge that these allegedly damning allegations were in fact relayed to Ribbentrop by a third-hand source, and through agents, all of whom wished to curry favor with the German foreign minister. In fact, one of those agents was Edward's host, Ricardo Espirito Santos, a wealthy Portuguese banker who had been selected to house the Windsors in Lisbon by the British ambassador to Portugal. Also rarely acknowledged is why the Windsors found themselves in Lisbon in the first place, which was as a consequence of having fled the incoming Nazi occupation of France. Now viewed as unequivocally damning for Edward, to his contemporaries, the emergence of the material as part of an Allied effort to publish the archives of the German Foreign Ministry was more frustrating than it was controversial. Even Dwight Eisenhower expressed surprise over the furor, telling Churchill in July 1953 that the documents for him, quote, had no possible value and were, quote, obviously concocted with some idea of promoting German propaganda and weakening Western resistance, and that they were totally unfair to the Duke. Murphy agreed with Eisenhower's assessment and believed the episode was, quote, merely another example of the Duke's unworldliness and lack of judgment. When the inevitable did happen and the material was published in 1957, many eminent men leapt to Edward's defense, including the British ambassador to Portugal, who took public responsibility for placing the Windsors in the proximity of hosts that he knew, even at the time, to have pro-German leanings. The allegations certainly did not disrupt Murphy's relationship with Edward, which continued unabated until the latter's death in 1972. Questions, of course, inevitably remain unanswered, one of which is undoubtedly whether views of Edward can ever truly move beyond being liked or disliked. Yet for the first time, through his unpublished words, deemed too personal and too revealing for his own lifetime, we are suddenly afforded a more direct approach. We glimpse a man who envisioned a modern brand of kingship, in which the private life of a king should remain at his discretion and will, and when faced with a conflict between professional and personal happiness, acted decisively and with courage to preserve both the institution he was born to uphold and the woman to whom he felt morally bound. We began to see that the decisions Edward made during the abdication were based on principle rather than weakness of will or moral confusion. I resist the view as well that Edward did not wish to be king. He himself balked at this suggestion, as he told Murphy in March 1950. It was a fine job, a great job, but not one, he decided, was worth compromising his chance of finding personal contentment. And it is perhaps the great tragedy in his life that in abdicating the throne, he also abdicated any future historical recognition of all that he accomplished for the British monarchy in the 22 years he had been a serving Prince of Wales. He established numerous trends which survive in today's modern monarchy. He crafted a more democratic, more empathetic vision of what a royal prince should be, and invested the job with a sense of civic purpose that thrives in today's contemporary royal family. He was also a pioneer in his attitude toward marriage, and he called publicly for adjustments to the traditional royal rule book. He, of course, failed to win those concessions for himself, yet has paved the way for his successors, including the current king. Few have acknowledged his legacy in this or any other arena, and it is my hope in this new and uncovered material we are forced to look afresh at this complex and complicated figure from the perspective of his own words. Thank you.
Thank you, Jane, so much. I imagine there are people who have questions or comments, and I have a microphone to bring to you if you have something. Oh, good.
Hi, thank you so much. It was fascinating.
Thank you.
I have read that that Wallace was actually some sort of scapegoat, that the powers that be didn't want him to be king at all, maybe for his newfangled ideas or for some other reason. Is that at all apparent in these writings? Was he aware of any kind of undercurrent of political pressure anyway?
So when they first began speaking about the abdication, which is August 1948, it's just in a conversation, and Murphy takes down the dictation. And in it, Edward expresses his belief that there was a movement to speed it up and get rid of him. I think he felt he didn't have the support of the government and the court, and I think that probably was correct. He had ostracized himself from, as I sort of tried to allude in the talk, he'd ostracized himself from the very traditional elements of the British court, in part because he had spent so much time away from Great Britain in the 20s, and then because when he returns, he adopts everything that they don't like. First of all, I didn't have time to talk about how very American he becomes. And instead of like his grandfather, Edward VII, who turned the dollar princesses into British aristocrats, he preferred to become American. And that antagonized, I think, a more traditional element of the court who saw that as being abrasive, confrontational, even though he felt it was simply him living out to his own inclinations. So I don't think he ever thought that they were using Wallace to get rid of him, but I think he felt throughout that he had no friends, which was correct. And I think that was one of the problems in the abdication. He had no support amongst, in the court and amongst the government. I mean, he had two cabinet ministers who were sort of quietly sympathetic, Duff Cooper I mentioned, another Sam Hoare, but none who were basically advocating, at least to Baldwin, that this thing should be given time to run out. I mean, Churchill is seen as Edward's supporter, but in fact, he really thought the thing would lose steam. If you just, don't do anything, he'll lose interest, just calm down. The government was trying to resolve the question quickly, and a lot of people in popular support particularly felt that was trying to get Edward out. And to be honest, I tend to agree with that. I think they wanted to end it quickly. They saw a ready-made successor that was far less confrontational and I think much more palatable. So I think it all wrapped up very nicely. So that's a very long answer, sorry.
You describe how in the 20s especially, Edward revolutionized the role of Prince of Wales and brought a sense of civic engagement and wanted to engage more with his subjects or his friends. Do you think enough of his perhaps revolutionary changes have stuck with the monarchy as it is today? And do you have an opinion about, is the monarchy, going to survive the way it is right now?
I mean, I absolutely think he's the architect of the modern monarchy. For example, he's the one who invents the job of a Prince of Wales. His father and grandfather had sort of opened things, as he called it, they sort of, the top-hatted geniality, he says at one point to Murphy. He decides, as Prince of Wales, he's interested in specific things, and that is what he's going to focus on. So, and again, not enough time to talk about this. He spent most of the 20s on veterans affairs because that was his interest after the First World War. He really comes to his own in 1929 with the economic crisis, and he becomes invested in sort of causes related to social housing initiatives. He tries to sort of instill in the Duchy of Cornwall better practices in terms of tenant housing, as well in sort of his a borough of London that he owned. He basically becomes something far more than a patron. We think now of the Prince of Wales, the Earthshot Prize, of course, Prince Charles, King Charles, the Princess Trust, where he has passions and interests, and he's engaging in those actively from a charitable perspective. That initiates with Edward. A Prince of Wales had not done that prior to him. And more so, he initiates the idea that a royal will go and have this kind of direct contact with the people they're meeting in these moments of sort of charitable engagement. So Edward in the 20s, he's going down coal mines, he's meeting with dock workers. That's again, one of the mention of the clothing was such a big deal because he felt it was completely inappropriate to go to these places in a morning coat and a top hat. I mean, it was ridiculous. And at one point, he's traveling through South Wales in the 20s, and they have this huge Daimler ready for him. And I cannot go through these unemployed areas in this car, and he insists that the car is changed out. He had a real, I think, pitch to what the monarchy needed to transition to in an age that wasn't a pre-World War I great dynasties moment. And he really was invested in the way monarchy could survive, but survival, he thought, was pivoting to a different type of doing things, which is everywhere now. I mean, the informality of the royals, the dress, I always think "Call Me William" supposedly is on his engagements. I mean, that so directly begins with Edward. And is the monarchy going to survive? I mean, they have a great ability to do that. I mean, I think they will. I think something will change when actually the British public starts asking perhaps the question of, well, who's paying for that then? I think that's going to be if the British public tunes into that, that will be the problem for the monarchy. And I think what they should try to do at that point is to pivot to being completely self-funded, which they're not. But I think that would be the thing that would eventually cause another crisis, as in 1997 with the death of Diana, which was their major crisis of the 20th century, apart from the abdication.
I'm curious on a personal level how this became your research focus. I mean, obviously, once you uncovered the materials.
Yeah.
but before then, how you got on this. And I'm also curious how the British public and historians responded to an American being the one to uncover.
So believe it or not, it all started at UD.
Did it?
Yeah, so Laura and I did my undergraduate at University of Delaware, which I had a great education, but I had a great professor whose interest was monarchy but national identity, and weaved my biographical interest in the royal family, which began when I was like very small and very weird, and transitioned that in more into sort of, how does the monarchy reflect British culture, but how does culture reflect the monarchy? How do those two systems work together? And, I've done other things in my professional life. Primarily, I've worked as an archivist and just private families. And, I've always felt with Edward VIII that there's such an interesting story there, and yet it's really oversimplified, as in case in point, the crown. There's a lot going on there. I mean, he is at times sort of a disagreeable character. He does things that you wish, why did he do that? So he's very flawed, but he's also very interesting, and he's understudied. And I think even with the book on 1937 that I thought I was going to write, I felt there was something new to say. And as a historian, I think we should be adding to the conversation rather than repeating what's already been told. And I felt I still think there's something to do there on 1937 possibly, but there's something. He's an underrated and understudied figure of the British monarchy. And in terms of how the British response to it is, what's been fascinating is there's basically been no response. It's been so interesting to see the difference in how audiences have received the book. I've had this is about my 12th talk I've given in the United States, and I've given 2 in Britain, one of which I volunteered for, so that doesn't count. I think the view of the British public is that I think it touches so many nerves. It touches the issues with Germany in the 1930s, because there's still a lot of collective guilt in British society around appeasement in the 1930s and where most of Britain stood vis-a-vis Germany. So I think Edward, in my opinion, has become a scapegoat for a lot of what happened in the 30s in Britain. It's easy to go and say, oh, he went to Germany. Well, this never was a problem for the Duchess of Devonshire, the famous Mitford sister who went to Germany and met Hitler. She was still completely plausible as a figure of sort of interest and benign interest in sort of British cultural life. I think it's been focused on Edward. That is also compounded with obviously the fact that he gave up the British throne. And I think you can only look at the continued obsession with the British press have about Prince Harry and Meghan Markle to see the way in which it touches a nerve, I think, in the British psyche to have someone who has rejected the very core of what they are proud of. The British press are continually writing about Harry and Meghan, how thrilled we are that they aren't there. Well, if you're that thrilled, why are you continuing to write about them? And I think Edward is that same, they're so uncomfortable with him. So it's basically been ignored. I did have it was serialized in the Daily Mail, but yeah, it's been ignored by the literary festivals, by speaking engagements. It's been in the United States that people have been interested and engaged with the material, which I think shows how perceptive we are.
In your research, did you find any notes that Murphy and Edward were using, any earlier notes or diaries that they might have been drawing on, or was this really the first time that Edward was thinking about this and writing this down?
So Edward kept a diary up to, I think, 1919. So he kept it during the First World War and as a young man. And so one of the problems with working with Edward for Murphy was that he could not remember any specifics. Like, if they didn't know, he didn't know dates, he didn't, it was all a jumble. He could have salient points and very interesting things to say, but the timeline was very murky. So a lot of not just Murphy's time, but he had 2 researchers who were paid by Time Inc. to be in France with him. And they were doing the research to make sure the chronology and the places were correct. And so this became another one of these like little maneuverings that happened because all of Edward's papers were left in Britain his photograph albums, which they consulted eventually, his diaries, his letters, and there was this kind of sort of tiptoeing around of, "Oh, I'm going to send Murphy over to have a look at Windsor, because Edward was throughout, he was so nervous about what his family would think of this. It went against every grain in his body to have done this. And I think he was compelled to do it by a real sense that he felt that he had been misjudged in many respects. But getting that material and doing that research was part of, in a way, how it got drug out along, because they had to kind of do it diplomatically, and they didn't want to freak out anybody in the palace, and the court was concerned. I mean, I didn't discuss it, but in the book, there's a lot of back and forth between Walter Monckton, his advisor in England, and then the private secretary to George VI and later Queen Elizabeth, who figures in The Crown, Tommy Lascelles. And Lascelles is basically trying to micromanage via Walter Monckton what is going to be said in this book. They were very concerned because there was a lot that could have been said about the British royal family's attitude that would not have looked very good. And I think, when people often at these things ask me about Harry and Meghan, or Harry's memoir, although I guess that's died down a little bit since it's been a while, but one of the fundamental differences was that Edward did not write this book to settle scores. He wrote this as a record of his royal career and to show that his royal career had meant something. And he was not interested in trying to air out all the many bickerings and the battles that had happened with his family, which I think is, in the list of things that he doesn't get enough credit for, I think that's one of them. But there was a huge amount of research that went into it, and a team, and Life probably put in $500,000 into those two sets of articles, through everything between Murphy's salary. And again, one of the things I didn't talk about was that Murphy actually brought his family over to France, and his younger daughter, who's still alive and lives in New York, was basically living around the Windsors for about 2 years, and she has these incredible memories of both the Duke and the Duchess. And I've told her, I said, you're probably one of the last people left who would, remember them, because she was like 7. So yeah, it was an incredible story about how this memoir was written and all the time that got put into it that just nobody had kind of paid attention to.
Great.
Can you speak about Wallace's personality? You hear that she was just an object of his affection, and she was just going along with whatever his wishes were. And then you also hear that she's an architect of, that she wanted to be queen, or that she wanted to go and visit Hitler because she wanted him to have that adoration and that feeling that he was still a head of state.
I mean, she would have felt that. Well, she would have agreed that that's how people thought of her. So again, I didn't in this talk. So Murphy comes back in 1954 and spends about 4 months in Paris working on her autobiography. And so Edward wrote the pages. Wallace was not a writer. And so he would interview her, and there are recordings of these interviews that exist, as well as transcript. And, she talks about the way in which she feels the public has blamed her and persecuted her for the outcome of the abdication. And I think, I'm not sure if I find her a sympathetic figure. I think via these conversations, you can certainly have an empathy for her position. I mean, she really views herself as being hated by the world. And I think in 36, 37, she probably was. And you can sense the way in which she's internalized the perspective of other people onto herself, and how that probably affected the way she lived her life up until, her death. I mean, it's so interesting about the photograph with Hitler. I mean, she was really aware of the power of that image by 1954. She talks about that image to Murphy and said, we were just leaving, and there was just this picture, and it was a goodbye, and that was it. That visit has been it has been amplified to the extent of absurdity, because it was very brief, it was unplanned, But she was aware of the way in which she herself had become sort of almost even the central person in that story, because of course he's holding her hand, and it looks as if, oh, she's finally gotten this kind of, this respect. And some biographers of the Windsor, in fact, a close friend who I like in a lot of ways, I'll go ahead and say Hugo Vickers, who's written on he always believes that that visit was to give her a state visit. I'm sure that attracted the Duke because he was so sensitive to the slights that he felt she had. The visit was entirely about himself, as much of their life was, which was to give him a jumping off point for a career he thought he was going to have, not dissimilar to what Prince Harry has thought he's going to do by these kind of quasi-visits that they've tried to undertake in the last few years.
Thank you so much. And I hope you all will come back and join us next week. We'll have Matt Taylor, who's written a book about white supremacy and Christianity's connection. He's a scholar at ICJS, and he has become one of the figures that folks on sort of either side of the issue go to because of his research. Very timely, and you'll meet him right here next